Brandish was released for the Super Nintendo by Koei in 1995. The PSP game, Brandish Dark Revenant, was released by Nihon Falcom in 2015. Though there are multiple versions of the game, these are the only two North American releases. So, what's the difference? The first difference you'll notice between these action RPGs is the graphics. The PSP game has been given a complete 3D overhaul. Characters have been redesigned or replaced completely. The NPCs have been redesigned too. The layout of the levels are the same for the most part, but they have more detail on PSP. And the screen is cropped on PSP as well. The next difference you'll notice is the gameplay. The Super Nintendo version has this immediate change in perspective every time you turn. Every time. It can be confusing and a major reason most people won't play the game. It takes some time getting used to, and even then it can still be frustrating. It can be interesting for exploration, as some items and objects can only be viewed from the right angle, but it's more bad than it is good. The PSP version fixes that by having the screen gradually move with you as you turn. No more confusion as to where you are, no more confusion as to which way you're facing. This was a major improvement, and so is the map. On PSP, you have a map on screen during gameplay. This makes it so much easier to keep track of where you are. It also lets you know where a change occurs when you hit a switch. On Super Nintendo, to see the map, you need to keep pressing start, which can be tedious and slow down the action. The PSP game also has a map when you pause, but it has more details. And even more changes were made to the PSP map. In both games, the map becomes visible as you walk in that area. The PSP game improves on this by giving you a percentage of how much of the map you've completed. And to sweeten the deal, every time you complete a floor at 100%, you get a well-deserved reward. It really encourages you to explore the map in the PSP game. You don't have any of that on Super Nintendo. You can also alter parts of the map on PSP, if you want to remember where something is. To be fair though, the Super Nintendo map does show unopened doors, and this can be really useful to remember where a locked door is. You'd have to mark it on the PSP, as the unopened doors don't appear on the map. The PSP game also simplifies the controls. To turn in the Super Nintendo game, you have to use the D-pad. To strafe, you need to hold L or R while using the D-pad. The PSP simplifies that by making the straight the default with the D-pad. To turn, you just use L or R. No D-pad necessary here. Basically, you need two buttons to do something on the Super Nintendo that only takes one button on PSP. There's some major changes to the gameplay as well. Let's start with the items. In the Super Nintendo game, you can only have one item ready to use. Otherwise, you need to open your menu. On the PSP, you have 3 items ready for use. Both games have dimensional boxes or otherworld boxes that let you carry more items. On Super Nintendo, if an item is in this box, you can't use it. First you need to transfer it out of the box and then you can use it. On PSP, you can use an item no matter what box it's in. Another difference is the inspector tool. It's used by holding L or R on Super Nintendo. It lets you read things, examine oddities, and talk to people. The inspector tool is gone on PSP. This is fine because items are no longer in bags, and you can read, examine, and talk with the triangle button. Another change is the saving. Every time you change floors on Super Nintendo, it automatically saves. Even if you fall down a hole, it saves. On PSP, new floors just act as new checkpoints. So if you take a long trip for nothing, you can just load from your last save. And the Super Nintendo game only has 2 save slots, while the PSP has as many as you want. Some changes were made to the enemies too. First off, enemies and bosses have life bars on PSP. No more guessing if the enemy is almost dead. Enemies also respawn a lot more in the Super Nintendo game. This makes it easier to gain levels and improve your stats, but it makes exploration harder and will certainly cost you weapons. Enemies do respawn occasionally on PSP, but it's a lot more exploration friendly. Boss battles have changed slightly too. On Super Nintendo, most bosses can be taken out with brute force if you're strong enough. On PSP, bosses have weaknesses or patterns you need to figure out. You need strategy on the PSP game. The boss of the game also has 2 forms, not just one like the Super Nintendo game. The menu is also cleaner on PSP. You can access everything easily. There's not really a menu on Super Nintendo. Instead, you scroll through all these options. So if you want to save, you always have to scroll through these other menus. The story has been slightly changed too, but it's not really a driving factor in either game. The names of the characters in certain locations were changed too. In the Super Nintendo, the names were changed from the original. The PSP game changed the names back to what they were in the PC games. Varric is now Eris, and Alexis is now Della. The PSP game removed some censorship as well. The Super Nintendo changed the sorceress's outfit by covering her up in a one-piece. The PSP changes it back to the original bikini design, cause we all know bikinis are better for magic. One thing is missing from the remake. The Super Nintendo game has an exclusive sound room. You can listen to any track or sound effect from the game. On PSP, it's been replaced by a casino, so gamble to your heart's content and earn exclusive items. Speaking of music, the soundtrack on PSP has been completely redone. The PSP game also lets you play with the updated soundtrack or the old 8-bit version. This even carries over to the cutscenes. The PSP version also has additional gameplay. After you beat the game, you can play it again as the sorceress, Della. You have whole new maps, new puzzles, and a good amount of difficulty. Overall, a nice solid addition. So, is it worth it? Absolutely. Fixing the change of perspective alone makes the PSP game better, and improvements to the map really solidifies it. It's so much easier to keep track of where you are on the PSP game. Then you have all these other improvements, graphics, a bunch of small improvements to gameplay, the updated soundtrack, and a whole additional gameplay mode. It's a win for the PSP in every category. The Super Nintendo game is still interesting to play. The change of perspective really makes the game unique, but it's not easily approachable. If you played the Super Nintendo game and didn't like it, the PSP game fixes everything. So if you want to try out Brandish, do yourself a favor and give Brandish Dark Revenant a go.